Thunderhead Chapter 6. They went down to dinner. When Rob added a bottle of Burgundy to the meal, even Charlie Sargent abandoned his wisecracking on the subject of the white foal and gave his attention to the roast ducks and mushrooms in cream. Ken was in the seventh heaven. After all, it had gone well, better than he had dared to hope. Thunderhead, what a name! And his father had stopped Howard from making fun of it. He glanced at his father and found the penetrating blue eyes fixed on him in a very thoughtful manner. The look made pins and needles go through him. It was the look by which his father ferreted out what he had been doing, where he had been, even what he had been thinking. Time was when Ken would try to keep his secrets, but he had found out it was never any use if his father actually put him on the witness stand. Ken dropped his eyes and busied himself with the fat drumstick. He took it up and picked it, glancing at his mother for permission. It helped to hide his face, but his cheeks were hot and his father was still looking at him. He didn't want to look back. He determined not to. He held himself from looking until all his body felt strained and anguished. Then he looked. His eyes met his father's, and after a second, a little smile appeared on his father's face, as if he had got what he wanted. After that his father didn't look at him any more, and when Colonel Harris asked, "What I would like to know is, why did you bring all the mares in just because you needed Banner? Was it just to give me that ride of the Valkyries? If it was, many thanks. I wouldn't have missed it. A little more and Taggart and I would have gone sailing right off the earth. I was hearing music already." Rob laughed and said, "Howard, tell Colonel Harris why we brought the mares in with Banner." Howard found it difficult to answer so simple a question. "Because he wouldn't have come without them, sir." "You mean," said Harris, astounded, "you can't take that stud anywhere without all his mares?" "All his mares and all his colts," answered Rob calmly. 20 mares, more or less, and 20 colts. That's his family. When he moves anywhere, 41 of him moves. "Anyway," said Howard, "you see, if he did come alone, how would he know that he'd ever see them again? Who would protect them? They're his responsibility, so he's got to take them along." "And when you want one of the mares, we bring them all in," said Rob. "Corral the mare, then Banner knows she's safe and being taken care of and held for him, and drive the rest out." Ken contributed nothing to the talk that followed. He was lying low, anxious for the meal to end as quickly as possible. When at last it did, and his mother had prepared the big pot of coffee and placed it on the tray with the cups and saucers to be taken out to the terrace, he was about to dash off to the stables, but his father's voice called him back. "Stick around, Ken. I might want you." Ken sat down on the edge of the stone wall which supported the terrace, his legs dangling over the flower border, and his back to the group on the terrace. They arranged themselves round the low wooden table and poured their coffee. Ken often sat this way when his parents had guests. You could hear everything they said if it was worth listening to, and if it wasn't, there was plenty to watch on the green and in the pines on the cliff or in the sky. Today his back was tingling because it was turned to his father, but he tried to forget what was coming and interest himself in something else. Down there by the fountain, a big robin was intent upon getting a worm. He sat over the wormhole, turning one ear to the ground, listening. Ken always thought for the movements of the worm to betray its exact position by some squeak or rustle. Then the sudden plunge of the beak, and out it came, holding one end of the worm, and the robin backed off, pulling. The worm stretched like elastic. Ken was fascinated. 2 inches of worm, 4, still the robin backed away. The suspense was terrific. "And now," said Rob genially, "Ken's got something to tell us. He's going to tell us who is really the sire of that white foal up in the corral." Ken had thought he was prepared for it, but it was a shock all the same, and unpleasant feelings went through him. He couldn't find words. His mind was in a fog. "The sire?" exclaimed Harris, astonished. "Why, what's this? I thought Banner was the sire of all your foals." "Not that one," grinned Rob. Your mare is perfectly safe, Mort. You'll have a fine little sorrel colt, dead ringer for Banner, when she foals next summer. I told you, Banner breeds true. Sorrels, like as peas in a pod. Ha! Exclaimed Charlie. You're crawling. Just because you've got a throwback, you're going to disown it. Didn't think of it. Come on, Ken, said Rob. Who is the sire of that little goblin up there? Ken, without turning around, jerked his head and elbow in the direction of Charlie Sargent. That big black stud of his. Whose? Mr. Sargent's. Ouch, shouted Sargent. Then, do you let him tell whoppers like that, Rob, or is he given to pipe dreams? Rob was as astonished as anyone. Appellation, Ken? Yes, sir. Why, he doesn't even know Appellation, shouted Sargent. Ken, did you ever see him? He's never been off my ranch, and that's 20 miles away. Ken answered. He's that big black stallion with 3 white socks and a white star between his eyes. He hangs out in that little drawer by the quake and asp and the box elder where the fence crosses your line, 20 miles away by the highway, but about 8 miles of straight riding across the country. Only one gate to go through, and your buck fence to take down. There was a shocked silence. Then, as Ken's words sank home, Charlie Sargent jumped to his feet. His long brown face was serious for once, his big hat a little awry, a frown between his brows. I don't believe it. It couldn't be. Why, that little misbegotten pup up there, son of Appellation, in 2 strides he reached Ken, seized him by the shoulder and yanked him up. Stand up here. He set the boy on the low wooden table facing them all. Ken's face was a little pale, but his dark eyes looked at his father without flinching. Come on, Ken, said Rob. Let's have the story. I'll begin it for you. A year ago last spring we decided Flicka should be bred. No, sir. It was the fall before that. About Thanksgiving time, you and Mother said we'd breed Flicka as soon as she was old enough and get a foal. That's right. I remember now. You and Howard were home from school for the Thanksgiving weekend. Yes, and when we went back to school all winter long I was thinking about that. And when I came home for the spring vacation at Easter, you remember you let me start working Flicka and riding her a little, because she was just exactly 2 years old and strong and well grown. And you said I was light enough so it wouldn't hurt her back any. And I worked her out with the blanket and surcingle and began to ride her. And during that vacation, do you remember the time you took me into town with you and we met Mr. Sargent and had dinner with him at the Mountain Hotel, and he was talking about his stud, about Appellation, and praising him and praising him. And then he got to brag, praising all the colts he had had from him. Ken paused, looking interrogatively at his father, and Rob grinned. Yes, I remember. He praised him. It's a habit he's got. Harris laughed, and Sargent's hand pinched Ken's shoulder a little harder, and he said, Get on with your story, young man. Well, so you see, when I went back to school after that Easter vacation, I was thinking about Appellation. Rob groaned. And when Ken begins to think about something, I don't mind telling you, it's a single-track mind. So, said Ken doggedly, when I got home in June, that's what I was thinking about. I rode over several times on Cigarette to look at Appellation. The hell you did, said Charlie. Well, with some eagerness, what did you think of him? Oh, Ken's voice rose in enthusiasm. Just what you did. I agreed with all the proud things you said about him. Thank you for that, son. And what then, Ken? Asked Rob. Well, that was about the time to breed Flicka, and you told me to see to it. Rob's eyes narrowed and glanced away as he tried to remember. Nell nodded. I remember that, Rob. You had moved Banner and the broodmares up onto the saddleback. There were just the saddle mares in, Flicka and Taggart, and you told Ken it was his responsibility, and that when she came around he was to take her to the stallion. Rob nodded. I remember. Well, Ken? Ken's words came with a struggle. Well, you see, I had been thinking and thinking about Appellation, because we wanted Flicka's foal to be a racer, and Banner was never a racer. And when I remembered all Mr. Sargent had said about him, and every colt he had got by him, why then? Well, prompted Charlie. Well, when she came in heat, I just rode her over there one day. It took me most of the day, and put her in the pasture with Appalachian. And when she was bred, I rode her home again. That's all. There was silence for a moment as Ken finished his recital. Suddenly Harris burst out laughing. Howard stared in open-mouthed awe at his younger brother. The stunt itself was nothing to the secrecy with which it had been concealed for more than a year. It was a faculty Howard was envious of, to do unusual things and then keep them entirely to yourself. Rob said, "You took that long 16-mile road on your mare?" "Yes, sir. I got off and rested her now and then. You were letting me ride her because you said she had grown so well, and I hadn't." It was true. Ken was still no larger than he had been at 10. Rob thought again. "You must have been away most of the day. I don't remember it." Ken said, "It was a day when you and Mother had been in town, and you stayed there for lunch, and you didn't get home until late in the afternoon." Ken was keeping his biggest punch to the end. "Anyway, I can prove it to you, Dad," he added. "How?" Ken stepped down from the witness stand and vanished into the house. They heard his steps going upstairs. He returned holding out a paper, folded and wrinkled and soiled. He handed it to Rob, who opened it with a mystified air and read it silently, and passed it to Charlie. Sargent stared at it long time, then read aloud slowly. "Flicka to Appalachian, 12:30 p.m., June 28th. Sargent flung down the paper, sprang to his feet and shouted, "I don't believe it!" Then, with one long leap over the flower border, turned his back and went striding up to the corral. "This beats me," said Rob. "I didn't dream it was Appalachian. I knew it wasn't Banner. What I thought was that the albino was somewhere in the neighborhood again and that he had got to the mare. Or perhaps that Ken's mind had been working overtime and cooked up some crazy scheme and that he had taken her out to him." Charlie came striding back. "Give me a drink, Rob. If this is true, it's a terrible blow." "It's true all right," said Colonel Harris. "I watched Ken's face when he told it. His face was straight and the story's straight." Charlie gulped down the drink Rob poured for him, and as Rob filled the other glasses, held his out again. "Hope this won't make you take to drink, Charlie," said Harris dryly. "Brace up, lots of people have family secrets to hide." "We won't give it away, Charlie," chuckled Rob. Charlie didn't even hear them. He threw off his hat and ran one hand distractedly through his hair. "Maybe it didn't take," he exclaimed suddenly. "Maybe later on in the summer she was bred by some other stallion. That's it," he said excitedly. "You said the colt came months later than you expected." But Ken shook his head. "She was never out on the range again. You see, that was the first summer I had been able to do much with her or ride her at all. She was a 2-year-old. And I had her down here in the stable or the home pasture all summer so that she would be well schooled by the time I had to leave the ranch in the fall, and there weren't any other stallions around." Nell nodded. "That's true. She was underfoot all summer. Ken did everything but have her in the kitchen." "I did have her in the kitchen, Mother. Remember the time you put the oak bucket in the kitchen sink, and I called her in, and she walked right in and went all around the kitchen looking at everything and smelling it, and then ate her oats at the sink?" "Look here, Ken," said Rob. "Do you realize that you stole that service? You heard what Mr. Sargent said at dinner, that the stud fee for Appalachian is $250. Ken's mouth dropped open. All the rest he had been prepared for, but this, he was always coming up against money. He made no answer. He turned to look at Charlie Sargent with the face of one condemned to the gallows. "I've always told you, Ken," his father rubbed it in, "that you cost me money every time you turn around." "Cost you money? Well, you owe that money to Charlie here, and you can't pay it, can you?" "No, sir. Someone's got to pay it." "I should say not," exclaimed Charlie. "If that's the Appalachian's fault, you owe me nothing. On the contrary, I owe Ken an apology, and the nice little mare too." Ken began to breathe again and glanced at his father to see if there were to be any penalties from that quarter. "If Mr. Sargent forgives you the debt, Ken, I've got nothing to say." "Here comes the gobbler now," exclaimed Howard. Gus had let the horses out of the corral to pasture, and Flicka and her foal and Taggart and the geldings were coming to water at the round stone fountain in the middle of the green. The men and boys went down to look at them more closely. "You'll just have to face it, Charlie. It's a throwback, all right. Throwback through Flicka to the albino, and your stud's blood wasn't strong enough to outweigh hers." "My stud's?" groaned Charlie. "It isn't his blood alone, but 60 generations of the finest racing blood, and this mare of Ken's outweighs them all and throws back to that wild Mustang." The colt, as usual, was not following his dam, but wandering here and there as he felt inclined. Flicka turned her head and nickered for him, then dipped her nose into the fountain and drank. "That's a beautiful mare," said Charlie, looking at Flicka's glossy golden coat, her full flaxen tail and mane, and the gentleness and intelligence in the golden eyes she turned to them. She mouthed the cool water, letting streams of it run from her muzzle, then turned her head to her foal again. "Dad," said Ken miserably, "is he really so awful?" Rob hesitated. "Well, Ken, nobody could say he has good conformation. He's shaped like a full-grown horse, a bronc at that. He'll have to change a good deal, but he will, Dad. He'll grow. He'll have to grow in some spots and shrink in others. That jughead." Ken looked at the head. It was certainly too large. It had a terribly stubborn look. "Hi, fella," said Charlie to the foal, then turned to Ken. "Well, you win, Ken. I believe your story. Your goblin is by my appellation, and if you want papers, you can have them. I only have half papers, sir, because Flicka only has half papers." "You oughtn't to have any papers at all with a stolen service, Ken," said his father. "I'll waiver that," said Charlie. "Do you realize, Rob, that this little goblin has appellation for a sire, Benna for a grandsire, and the albino for a great-grandsire? That ought to be enough TNT to bust him wide open." Harris said quizzically, "And the greatest of these is the albino." Matilda came dashing out. She charged at the colt, who was standing with legs braced, head hanging a little. He poked his nose at her and did not flinch. Matilda swerved, sprang up onto the coping of the fountain, ran around it, jumping off again just before she reached Flicka's nose. Highboy swung his dripping muzzle out over the grass and took a long step towards the cat. She crouched, lifted a paw and tapped him smartly on the nose. Then, as he advanced again, she dashed away, sprang up the trunk of one of the young cottonwood trees and hung out on a branch, long yellow tail and one taloned claw hanging down, waiting her chance, Goblin watching it all. Rob was still speculating. "Maybe your stud isn't so much after all," he suggested. "I presume all these winners you've been bragging about, excuse me, I should say praising so, that's a good word, Ken, had fine blood mares for their dams." "Well, sure. Perhaps their racing successes came from their dams and not from appellation." "A little more of this and I'll be going home to shoot him." "Have another drink, Charlie," said Colonel Harris, "and calm yourself. Ever read 3 Men in a Boat? Well, it's your shirt now. That's the only difference. One good thing." He sipped his highball. "This clears Banner." Ken stood looking at the foal. His confidence had been whittled down by the many contemptuous comments about it. The name of Goblin had stuck, not the other. Even he himself was thinking of it as Goblin now. Where was the beautiful name and all the pride and glory? The foal turned and looked at him. The pupil of the eye was dark. The edge of the lids and the eyelashes were dark too. Between pupil and the lids was a ring of white eyeball, a white ringed eye. That was why the foal had that wild, furious look. Ken felt suddenly completely beaten. A car drew up and stopped at the end of the terrace, and there descended from it several visitors. As Nell went towards them and the salutations began, Ken fled into the house and out to the back door. He had had all he could stand, and now it would begin all over again, about the white foal and appellation, and what he had done. It was publicity he was running away from, the blistering heat of it, the inescapability of it, the way you had to stand and take it, and take it, and take it. Oh, when would it end? How long would it be before all this was forgotten, and they could think of it calmly, as if it were unimportant? When could he be unimportant himself again? He ran up the hill at the back of the house and in amongst the trees. Then he began to cry. It was because he suddenly knew that there wasn't going to be an end to it at all. Not with the goblin. Not with that furious, jug-headed throwback with the white-ringed eyes, who was destined, by him at least, to be a great racer and had the ancestry for one. In fact, it was all just beginning, and it was he himself who had started it, and he would have to go on taking it for a long time. And what at the end of it all? Would Goblin be a great racer? Probably not. Probably nothing. That's what they all thought. He threw himself face down on the pine needles. He was crying because he had got himself in such a mess and couldn't get out again. He couldn't undo the fall. But deep down he knew he didn't want to. Mess or no mess, he was crazy about the goblin. It was Flicka's, her first. The great destiny had been planned by Nell long ago, and everything had been done to bring it about. Half of his sobbing was because of this love that was bursting his heart for the ungainly little creature that had turned away from him and looked at him with a resentful white-ringed eye. He was crying, too, from disappointment. He had taken it for granted that Flicka's foal would be a beautiful, black, aristocratic and long-legged and fine-headed, with 3 white socks and a star on its forehead, or, perhaps, a golden sorrel with flaxen tail and a mane like its mother. And some of the tears were pure relief that the year-long deception of his father was over and his conscience clear at last. When the weeping was over, he turned on his back and let the wind dry his eyes and his cheeks. He was beginning to be happy again. Peace had come into him. Bit by bit he was accepting all that had happened and all that lay ahead. Whatever it was, he could get through somehow. And the fall. Absent-mindedly, Ken's eyes were outlining the shape of a great white cloud in the sky. It was one of the solid ones, as if it were carved out of marble, dazzling white. Suddenly he recognized that cloud. It was the thunderhead that had given the foal its name. The cloud had pushed slowly up over the horizon to the zenith. Other thunderheads crowded it from the rear and the sides. The shape had changed a little, but it was the same, and like an old friend to Ken. More than that, like a renewal of the promise and the hope. Blissfully, he flung both arms out on the ground, his face turned up to the cloud. It's the end of chapter 6.